Hello, my name is Daniel Lord, and I will be doing a presentation today on an article by an academic paper by Michael Rosanowski and Glenn E. Snellbecker. And the article is on the effects of framing on measures of risk and tolerance, and it specifically focuses on how financial planners are not immune. So to introduce the paper, um, first discuss that prospect theory suggests that describing the objective risk inherent in a situation in terms of how much can be gained will lead to risk avoidance, whereas describing the same exact situation in terms of the potential losses to be suffered leads to risk-seeking behavior. This effect has been called framing. Um, Most people tend to be risk-seeking if faced with a choice between a sure loss and a probable loss. Most people are risk averse and opt for the certain event instead of the probable event when both available options involve gains. This study investigates whether the bias occurs among a professional group that deals with financial risk as part of their work. The results show that financial planners are not immune to the framing bias. So to continue the introduction here, this the, this idea of framing, there was an article by, or a paper by Kahneman and Tversky, and they had a study that has this example that's shown here. And I share this because the study that we're going to focus on here is based off of this particular study. So in this example, it tells us imagine that the United States is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences of the programs are as follows. There's two distinct sets of alternatives represented to two different groups. For one group, the consequences were worded or framed in terms of gains. Namely, if program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. The alternatives presented to the second group were framed in terms of losses. If group C is adopted, 400 people will die. If group D is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that no one will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So if you look at these two options that are given, in reality, mathematically, the options are both the same. But as we see here, in 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 the two different alternatives that were given, one was given in more of a risk-seeking, or more in terms of framed in terms of gains, and the other was termed and framed in terms of losses. And we see that people are more risk-seeking when options are framed as lives lost, and more risk-adverse when options were framed as lives saved. That's shown here in the results. You know, option A and option C were equivalent, and option B and option D were equivalent. But as we see here, depending on how it was framed, the different options were chosen, and risk-seeking and risk-averse options were different in each of those situations. We'll look quickly here at some of the literature that led to this study. So as I've already mentioned, Tversky and Kahneman have a couple of different papers out there about prospect theory that definitely led to this study. Levin, Johnson, Russo, and Delden had an article about how about framing a gamble in terms of gains versus a loss. Levin, Snyder, and Chapman had an article that kind of introduced gender and experience and how they can impact framing decisions. Two of the papers that more specifically led to this particular study was one by Northcraft and Neal. And in this paper, they speculate that special training, repeated exposure to risk, or natural selection may make experienced individuals less risk-seeking when faced between a choice between a certain loss and the risk of a loss of a larger or no loss. But they did not complete a study on this. They only suggested that that may be possible, that may be something to consider. And Dixon wrote had an article that found, or a paper or study that found that managers in charge of risk management were more likely to be risk averse in loss situations than managers with other responsibilities. So kind of combining these two thoughts here, um, this study was created with the intent to determine if financial planners with the experience that they have are more likely to be to fall victim to the to the framing bias. So the method here that we'll look at. So the data were collected from attendees at several financial planning conferences and individuals undertaking courses in financial services. Each respondent completed a brief form titled Survey of Views about Investment Strategies. 4 variants of this form were used, consisting of the 4 possible combinations of the treatment variables. And we'll explain that a little more on following slides. So real quickly here, we'll look at an example of the survey questions asked. And you'll see that it very closely mimics the question that was asked in the Tversky and Kahneman study. Just with some slight modifications and more adapting it towards a financial situation as opposed to lives lost or gained. So here it tells us, imagine that your client has $6,000 invested in the stock market. A downturn in the economy is occurring. You have 2 investment strategies that you can recommend under the existing circumstances to preserve your client's capital. If strategy A is followed, $2,000 of your client's investment will be saved. If strategy B is followed, there's a 1/3 probability that the entire 6,000 will be saved and a 2/3 probability that none of the principal will be saved. Given this information, which of these 2 strategies would you favor? There's a check mark in front of your choice, strategy A or strategy B. So that was one of the options that was presented to these financial planners. In the corresponding loss frame, so as opposed, that was more in the gain frame. So in the loss frame, the 2 possible strategies were described as follows. If strategy A is followed, $4,000 of your client's money will be lost. If strategy B is followed, there's a 1/3 probability that nothing will be lost and a 2/3 probability that $6,000 will be lost. So as you see, once again, these are identical situations mathematically, but one is presented in a gain frame and one is presented in a loss frame. These were 2 of the options that were presented. These same 2 situations were presented to other financial planners at the same conference, but in terms of their money being lost or gained, not their clients. So we'll look at the data analysis from the results here. So results were analyzed primarily using an analysis of variance. Age and experience were put on 2 different levels using a median split. So for age, the age of 43 was the median. So those who were above 43 and those who were below 43 were in different categories. And then 7 years of experience was the median. So those above 7 years of experience and those below 7 years of experience were in 2 different categories as well. The data were submitted to a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 fixed effect ANOVA. And we'll see what all those different variables were on the next slide. The data were collected from attendees at several financial planning conferences and individuals undertaking courses in financial services. And as I explained, each subject received only one of the 4 possible forms of questions. So it's a non-repeated design. They didn't do it in both the gain and loss frame, things like that. So here are the variables. So there were the treatment variables. There were 2 of them. There was the frames, whether it was a gain or a loss. And then there was the ownership of the money at risk, whether it's the client's money or your money being the financial planner's money themselves. Then there were independent variables. There were 3 of them. They all had to do with demographics. So there was age, sex, and experience. So those were the 3 demographics or independent variables that were used. And then the dependent variable was the riskiness of one's preferred choice. So whether it was a certain outcome or a probable outcome. So there obviously, by being, that there are so many variables, there were a large amount of results. But we'll focus here on the key results from this study. So the ANOVA revealed significant main effects for frame and money ownership. You can see that these are significant, that these main effects are significant because the F values are very high, 7.43 with regards to frame and at 5.91 with regards to money ownership. Also, they have very low p-values, which means that the probability that this wasn't true or accurate is low. Um, so 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 frame and money ownership had a significant impact in this. The three subject variables did not produce significant main effects, but they were involved in a number of significant interactions. So we'll look at that real quick here. There were two significant double interactions. The first of these occurred between age and sex. The second one involved sex and ownership. In addition, a triple interaction involving age, ownership, and frame was found. That was another key factor here. And lastly, there also emerged one significant four-way interaction involving age, sex, ownership, and frame. Now, one thing stated in the paper is that there wasn't anything really that more significant in the four-way interaction than was found in the triple interaction involving the age, ownership, and frame. So that's where we'll really focus as we're looking at these results here. So we'll look at table 1, and table 1 discusses the riskiness of choice as a function of money ownership, frame, and age. So you have kind of all the data here. So a couple of things key things we'll look at is, as you can see, in generally speaking, when these financial planners were presented with a gain frame, it was much more likely that they would take the sure bet or be more risk averse. In general, between all of them, that is seen. Also, we can take a look here and see that for those who received the loss frame surveys, they were much more likely to be risk seeking. They would take the probable event. One thing that is just interesting to point out is how dramatically you see that in the your money loss frame for those over the age of 43. They were far more likely to be more risk seeking with their own money in the loss frame, and that is found right here, where 84% of them went with the probable situation as opposed to the sure bet. Another thing to look at here is the difference between the decisions that were made or taken with regards to whether it was their money, their own money, or their client's money. In general, you can see that they were more risk adverse when dealing with their client's money as opposed to their own money. So that could be seen here, 60.9% in the gain frame with the client's money took the sure bet, as opposed to 47.8% in the gain frame with their own money took the sure bet. Even more dramatic down here, you can see in the loss frame with the client's money, 40% took the sure bet, as opposed to 15.6%. So, I mean, looking back, kind of comparing across the board there, you could see that in general, these financial planners had less of a framing bias when dealing with their clients' money as opposed to their own money. So we'll look at some of the major conclusions other than what we already discussed here. Financial planners are prone to the same framing biases that occur with the population at large. That was very clear to see in the results. In general, they stuck with what would be expected from the results of a framing bias, with being more risk averse in a gain frame and more risk seeking in a loss frame, as we saw on this chart. Another key conclusion is that people who deal with financial risk on a daily basis do not, as a result of their experience, become immune to the bias introduced through a framing of the alternatives in terms of gains as opposed to losses. So not only are financial planners prone to the same framing biases, but we see that their experience doesn't really have that much more of an impact. They still are subject to these same biases. And third, the financial planners seem to be more cautious in how they handle their clients' money than their own money. And that is likely due to the experience that they have. So that we do see that there is some benefit of their experience where there's a little more caution, a little more risk aversion, a little more um, lack of the framing bias due to the training that these financial planners have when dealing with their clients' money. So something that a key takeaway from this would be, that it's important to recognize that although financial planners have training and experience, that may provide some benefits as far as caution and avoiding of different biases like the framing bias. They are not immune to it. So it's something to consider when dealing with financial planners, that both you and the financial planner may have some inherent biases such as framing bias. And so decisions that are made need to take that into consideration. So that is the conclusion of this presentation. And I thank you for taking the time to listen. And I invite you to continue to learn more about the framing bias as I have. Thank you.